All right, well, here I am with Dr. Joel Warsh, best-selling author of Between a Shot and a Hard Place, Tackling Vaccine Questions with Balance, Data, and Clarity. You guys can check out his book at theshotbook.com. Fantastic book for anybody who has questions about vaccines. And what I love about this is Dr. Joel really comes at it with a balanced approach. He's really trying to meet patients where they're at. And so many people have gotten information from both sides, from people that are considered quote unquote anti-vax, which is something I've been labeled as for questioning vaccines, and people that are very, very pro-vaccine, that believe every child should have the full vaccine schedule. And he's kind of in the middle here and trying to balance this conversation and bring these two sides together and create, some sort of an idea of where we can meet in the middle and how we can improve overall children's health, because we have a big issue, obviously, with our overall childhood health and chronic disease epidemic in children. And so, Dr. Joel, let's start there. Obviously, we've got this major issue with childhood obesity and just overall disease when it comes to kids, and it seems to be growing every single year.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me on. And yeah, I mean, it's really frustrating as a pediatrician and as a dad to watch the numbers and look at the statistics and see the direction that we're moving. And for years, I've been talking about this maybe for a decade or so, but it wasn't really something that was discussed almost at all until the last year, and that was really, really frustrating. I mean, we're seeing numbers like 50% of kids have a chronic disease now, something in that range. Adults like 75%. Obesity is skyrocketing. Autoimmune conditions are skyrocketing. Cancer in kids is skyrocketing. Autism, ADHD, neurodevelopmental concerns, like everything on the list of chronic conditions seems to be skyrocketing all at the same time. And we need to do something about that. I don't want my kids to be on multiple medications. I don't want them to have a chronic condition, and I don't want other kids to have that. And that's why I got into pediatrics in the first place. I love working with kids. I wanted to prevent disease. I wanted to get ahead of things. And that doesn't seem to be the way that the system is working, and certainly wasn't working when I was working in the hospital and seeing 20 kids a day or 30 kids a day. It was pills, 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 and that's not the answer. I mean, I'm not against modern medicine. I think we have a lot of great medications. That's wonderful, and we can cure and save people. So nothing against modern medicine, but that's not the solution to prevent chronic disease and prevent all these illnesses. And so we do have to discuss this. We have to talk about it. We have to get back to the basics, and we have to be able to talk about everything and not just say, we're just better at diagnosis. That's what's going on. That's not what's going on. We are better at diagnosis. That's part of it, but really we have a problem, and we need to see how we can fix that problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, the rates are just going up every single year of all cause morbidity and mortality when it comes to kids. It's a serious issue. And so what do you think some of the main factors are with that?
I mean, the first thing is that we don't know, right? I think that's the big travesty. We've seen this happening over the last decade or so. I mean, it's been going on for 30, 40 years, I would say. But really in the last decade, we've seen a huge increase. And this should have been question number one. It should have always been question number one, like, what is it? What's going on? What can we do? How do we modify it? And until the last year, we weren't really even talking about it that much. So I think personally it's our crappy food. I think we're nutrient depleted. We're eating way too much processed food and way too much sugar and way too many ultra processed foods. And then also we're just surrounded by so many chemicals at all times. So I think those are the two big factors. But the fact that we don't have a list of like, here are the top 10 things that are happening, here's what we need to do, here are the big things we're going to change in government and policies that we're going to change, I think that's a travesty. And whether you're political or not, I mean, I don't think health should be political, but I am glad it became a little bit political in the last year, because at least we're talking about it now. And I think that we need change, and whether you agree or not with Secretary Kennedy and what they're doing, I mean, we certainly are seeing change, and that's absolutely needed. We can argue about how that change should occur and whether things are all right or, going in a better direction. I mean, that's debatable, but that we need to change is not debatable. And I'm glad that we are seeing a lot of movement and a lot of changes, and I hope that there's going to be a net positive in the next 5 to 10 years, which is really what we need.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I really wish politicians were doing something about this, but these numbers have gone up, and it really hasn't become a political, other than just trying to get people more access to medical care. It's really about all the political world has done up until now, up until the Make America Healthy Again, which is great. We want everybody to have some level of access to medical care, particularly emergency crisis care. That's a great thing. Let's get everybody access to that. However, we're not doing anything to really promote health up until this Make America Healthy Again movement. And of course, RFK as a spokesperson for that. And, he's somebody who came out of, being an environmental lawyer, right? And just seeing the amount of toxins that were in our society. And then he got turned on to the idea, wow, our kids are sick and suffering. And these toxins that are in our environment are playing a role with that. Obviously, fish are dying. We're seeing, animal, wildlife developing more chronic disease, dying due to pollution. So this must be affecting us as well, these toxins. And like you mentioned, that was, one of the key factors. And so then he got turned on to health and human health and seeing how these toxins were impacting us. And they're all over the place. And they're being really not being regulated well. And it's great, obviously, in our food system as well, with all the artificial dyes and chemicals. And most people don't realize, but these synthetic compounds that are in our food are made from basically from oil, right? They're made from petroleum, made from different byproducts of the oil industry, and that's not meant for us to consume. And so and people are consuming so much of this on a regular basis, so it's a really big deal. And what are we seeing with RFK? Like, I know you're on Instagram, you're constantly on top of it with your posts, all the different things that are taking place. As of this recording, early October, what are some of the big things that RFK has done with the Make America Healthy Again movement?
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much going on, and it seems like every day or every couple of days there's some new big announcement, and everybody's mad about something. But at least for me, I guess even before I talk about what's going on, like when it comes to the Maha movement, I was talking about health forever, well before this ever happened, and I'm happy to be involved in whatever way that I can to support kids. Again, I don't think it should be political. I'm glad we're talking about it. Make America Healthy Again. We want people to be healthy, so there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not huge on catchphrases, but I think that we do need to work together, and I try to support whatever I can. I don't always agree on everything, but I think that there's a lot that we can come together on, and a lot of good stuff that has happened, and I know that not everyone loves him. Some people love him, some people don't love him, but I think it's really unfortunate that we can't come together on the things that we do agree on. And the reality, when you even see people on the far opposite sides, they tend to agree on like 75% of the things going on. It's like everyone agrees we need a healthier environment. Almost everybody agrees, except if you're a company, that we got to get rid of GRAS, generally recognized as safe standards. And that's one of the big things that they've talked about is kind of, for those that don't know, it's basically a company can create a product for food and just put it in there, and they do their own studies and they say, yeah, well, we've done the research and it's safe. Whereas it's very different in other countries where you have to prove that it's safe. But here you don't actually really have to do that. You just say that it's safe. And that's one of the big reasons why we have so many chemicals in our food, as opposed to other countries where it's not to say that everything in our food is toxic, but a lot of things we just don't actually know. And we don't know how it interacts with other food products. So that's, I think, a big thing that they're tackling. And now there are big areas, just the ingredients in foods in general. So really trying to push companies first to remove products and ingredients that we either know are unhealthy or are likely unhealthy. So like the chemical food dyes, like high fructose corn syrup, like some of the other, many other ingredients. So there's this big push to remove some of those ingredients. And again, I think that's good. That's where sometimes people, kind of are arguing, I think right now, is like, well, do we really need to be pushing companies to get these products out of food? Like if you take a food coloring out of a ultra-processed food, that doesn't really matter because it's still an ultra-processed food. And I think on the grand scale, that's probably true, right? I think, just because you take out a processed food dye from a snack, it doesn't make it good for you. But I do think, and the good thing is we're actually talking about it, right? I mean, yes, there's a lot of argument around it, but it starts somewhere. It's not so easy to change the whole system. It's not so easy to change how food is grown or other things like that, but it is easy to change the ingredients in food and remove things that we know are the worst offenders. And so again, it's like they've only been there for not even a year, and there's more discussion around these ingredients than ever. So I think that's maybe the biggest thing that's actually a really huge positive. Because again, I don't think that anybody disagrees that chemical food diet doesn't need to be in food. Like we can use a natural food diet. It's still probably not great for you, but it's certainly better than a processed food diet. But then people are like, well, that's not important. I'm like, but it is important because you have to start somewhere and we need to talk about it. So I think that by far is the biggest thing. Getting these discussions going has been great. There's been a lot of discussion around vaccines. So that's a big push to really work towards more research, more data, more openness, more discussion, more nuance in the vaccine conversation. And I think that overall has been good thus far, because I do think that there is a lot of concern around vaccines in parents. That's why I wrote the book in the first place, Between a Shot and a Hard Place, because we couldn't talk about it before this last year, really. It was so censored. Everything was just, oh, they're perfect, safe and effective, just go do it, just listen to me because I said so. And that wasn't working anymore. Parents are very hesitant. There's a lot of concern. There's a lot of pushback after COVID. And the solution isn't to censor. It's to actually have discussions around it so people can feel confident in what they're doing. So that's one of the big reasons I wrote my book. But that's one of the other big things we're talking about. Obviously, Tylenol was a big discussion point in this last few weeks. And again, I'm not sure that the messaging around it was the best. And I think there's a lot of debate about maybe the way it should have been presented. But ultimately, there is a lot of evidence around Tylenol potentially having some association with autism. I think that it's very reasonable when you're talking about a medication that so many people take to have caution around it. We have caution around every medication in pregnancy. We already have very strict recommendations around Motrin, ibuprofen, around aspirin. So I don't see why Tylenol would be any different. We should take it with caution. Doesn't mean you can't ever take it. Doesn't mean it's definitively proven to cause autism. Even if it does cause it or have a strong association with it, it's still a very small relationship there, and there are many other things going on. But sure, these are things we should be talking about, because you shouldn't take a Tylenol willy-nilly when you're pregnant or ever, right? Yeah. So I think all those things are good. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, Tylenol, obviously, it will reduce a fever, right? And in some cases, life-saving cases, that's super important. But it'll also deplete your glutathione, slow down liver detoxification. And like we talked about earlier, with all these different toxins that we're dealing with, glutathione is really critical for liver detoxification, for the sulfation pathway, really critical for taking toxic substances and helping to deactivate them so your body can eliminate them. And Tylenol, we know, depletes that and just slows down overall liver function. So the more that we're taking that, the slower our liver is going to function. Now, like you said, the nuance is if somebody's got a really, really high fever, that fever could also damage the developing child, right? So we've got to do something to bring down that fever. But just to take Tylenol because you've got a mild headache or something along those lines, that's not when you'd want to use it.
Yeah, and I think that messaging is great, and it should have always been there. And I feel like that is the messaging that they wanted to get across. They just didn't do it very well, at least at first. But the bigger message there, and this is another big part of what what Secretary Kennedy is working on, is a messaging around we take too many medications, right? We take way too many medications as Americans, and more medications is not better. We're one of the sickest populations in the world. Our life expectancy has been going down. We have more chronic disease. It's not solving things. So that doesn't mean that a medication can't save your life or isn't a good thing sometimes. But we're so quick to give medications. Our doctors, that's the only tool in their tool belt. We jump to giving ADHD medications and antidepressants and antipsychotics and all of these things where we take, I just posted, someone was talking about the ADHD medications, and we're like 5% of the world and 80+% of the ADHD medications in the world. And again, it's good that we have identification of these issues. It's good that we're talking about it, but we don't have 80% of the kids with ADHD in the world. So we're doing something different. And yes, we want to support those kids that need support, but I guarantee you, of those 80% of kids, there's at least probably 20, 30, maybe 50% of those medications that probably are not needed, or maybe not needed as much. And maybe there are other things that could be done. Maybe it's the environment those kids are growing up in. Maybe it's the foods they're eating, the toxins. If they had the ability and the interest in getting a full workup and a full discussion about everything else besides the medication, maybe there is a way that kid doesn't need to be on a medicine. But that's our tool right now. That's the thing that we're using. And so I hear the bigger discussion, and the thing coming out of HHS is like, look, we're taking too many medications, and there's a lot of, even with antidepressants, that's I think the next thing coming out, right? I mean, there's a lot of whispers about that, and then people go, oh, but we need our antidepressants because it saves lives, and nobody's saying that it doesn't. But that doesn't mean that everybody should be on an antidepressant. That means we have a society problem if everybody needs to be on an antidepressant, not that the medication is the problem, but we have to look at the root cause here.
Yeah, we need to use more caution and have other tools, right, in the tool belt. And as a pediatrician, when you were going through medical school, how much in your medical school training, how much focus was there on nutrition, on exercise, good sleep habits, things like that?
Yeah, really nothing, right? I mean, very, very minimal, if anything. I mean, certainly you learn about nutrient deficiencies, right? So when we're talking about nutrition in medical school, at least where I went, which is a very good program, I went to Children's Hospital Los Angeles, a top five program. Um, you learn about beriberi and
Sure.
scurvy and those kind of things. Like you learn the basic like
Yep.
nutrient deficiencies and how you could treat it, maybe. But I mean, even those are things you'd really never see these days. But you don't really learn anything about what to eat or ultra processed foods or sugar or generalized nutrition, and so you just don't have. That's not really a thought that comes into your mind. Like a thought when you see a patient with a rash is not like maybe they're eating something that's causing that rash. Like that's just not the way we're trained um, in general, and that's a big error given where we are. But also we have to just keep in mind that like a lot of the paradigm of medicine was built a while ago, where it was really about infectious disease, and that was the big issue, and that's not as big an issue anymore. I mean, obviously we're still worried about infectious diseases, but where I think we're a lot more concerned these days about chronic diseases. But the medical training hasn't caught up to prevention and discussion about chronic disease, not really. And the most discussion around chronic disease is identifying what it is through lab testing and through whatever means, and then how do you treat it with a medication like that. That's the training, and it's important to learn that, but that's not all that we need to learn. And I think we need to adjust that. And same thing with vaccines. I mean, I get asked vaccines questions all the time because I'm in the integrative space, and the reality is we don't learn almost anything about vaccines, right? And I think that's shocking, and it's shocking to me looking back because you don't think about it at the time. You're taught, okay, here are the horrible diseases we used to have. Here is the vaccine that we have. We don't have these horrible diseases anymore. Thank you for these vaccines. This is our religion. Yay, yay, vaccines. Here's your schedule. Go do it. And that's what you learn, and that's what you go do. And you don't really ever question it. You don't really think about it. You don't really ever think that there could be a different way or an alternate way, or that we should be asking questions or we should be improving it. It's just these are the greatest thing ever. Let's go do it. And there's a huge pushback on that now because there's a lot more information out there, social media. We went through COVID. People saw reactions. They never thought about vaccines probably for the last 20, 30 years. And now they are. And so now there's a big, I guess, reckoning on the whole vaccine paradigm because people are looking back and saying, wait, this is the research. This is what was actually done. This is what we're basing it on. This is what we're giving our kids 30, 40, 50 vaccines. Like, where do we need to do this? Can we do something different? Like, there's a lot of questions going on.
Yeah, for sure. Like, we're talking about infectious diseases. We're talking about things like polio, cholera, different things like that smallpox that, killed a lot of people hundreds of years ago, or, maybe 100, 200 years ago. But with sanitation, a lot of changes like that, we have less of a infectious disease burden, although it could potentially, people can still get some of these things. But I mean, we've got vaccines for all kinds of stuff like chickenpox. Like I had chickenpox when I was a kid, and I had it for several days, and I got over it, and now I have immunity. That's the way I was taught. In fact, we had a chickenpox party, right? You probably did as well.
Right. Yep. Oh, yeah.
And so now we're told just get the vaccine, right? You got to get the vaccine for the chickenpox, so you never have to deal with that. But and that's the case with a lot of these things. Even measles was like that, right back in like the 60s and 70s before they came out with the MMR, the measles vaccine. It was typically something I remember, seeing a Brady Bunch episode where they just laughed about, the kids getting measles. They kind of laughed about how they would just miss school and sit around the house. And so it wasn't taken as seriously, although some people may have had, serious encounters with it, just like with anything. For most people, it was not looked at as something serious, but we've created all these vaccines, and then there's this huge pressure campaign on parents that you've got to get these vaccines, otherwise, your kids are going to get sick, they're going to die. And for obviously, in a lot of states, you can't even go to school. Like there's not even proper exemptions if a parent chooses to opt out. And so how did that all come about?
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting when you look back at history, especially in the context of what we're taught in medical school. So I mean, for me, it's really shocking when you really actually look at and go back through the history and the discussion around like whether vaccines actually were the reason why we don't have all this death, right? Because that's kind of the messaging that you get. It's like, oh, vaccines saved us. If we didn't have any vaccines today, everyone would just be dying left and right from these diseases. And the reality is that that's really far from the truth in general. You go back to the 30s, 40s, 50s, and yes, before that there was a lot of death from a lot of these things. There was a lot of death from smallpox and other diseases, but before that, so in the early 1900s, between like 1900 1950 especially, we had a lot of things that changed in our environment. So we had modern sanitation, so we didn't have just horses pooping everywhere in the streets. We had toilets, we had running water. We had an understanding of what disease even was, so people washed their hands. We had
And there
antibiotics
was a
that
lot
were
of
developed.
contaminated water back then
Yeah,
too. There
exactly.
really
Contaminated
wasn't
water,
a
like the
separation.
cholera epidemics, things like that. Washing hands. We had hospitals and surgeries and just an understanding of disease. So before the vaccines came out, almost all of the diseases had near zero mortality. So very few people were actually dying before these vaccines came out. Like measles, for example. Like, yes, there was a lot of deaths a long time. I mean, not even that many deaths, but there was certainly death. But it was almost down to zero before vaccines came out. And even the way to think about it, if you kind of step back, like tuberculosis, rheumatic fever. These are things that used to kill a lot of people that a vaccine never really, I mean, there are vaccines for them, but they're not routinely given in the population, and we barely see it anymore. So I imagine if we had given rheumatic fever or a tuberculosis vaccine in 1950, we would say now, oh, it's because of the tuberculosis vaccine that we don't see tuberculosis anymore in regular healthy people, which isn't true, right? We're not giving it and it's gone. So I think a lot of the other diseases are actually quite similar, where because we're a lot healthier, because we have better nutrition in general, like people are getting their calories, they're not starved, and we have an understanding of disease and secondary infections like pneumonia, where we can treat them with antibiotics, we really wouldn't see very much death from these diseases, even if there wasn't vaccines. And I think that's something that's really important to note. Not zero, like there certainly are still deaths from some of these things, but we wouldn't see a lot of deaths. And for measles, like you said, we've created this boogeyman. It's not really that scary. I mean, even before the vaccine, there were only a couple hundred deaths, like maybe 300 to 500 deaths in millions of cases, millions and millions of cases. So the flu, for example, right now kills tens of thousands of people every year. And we're not walking around like super afraid of the flu, but yet the measles, even at its worst, didn't kill that many people. So I don't think it's something we need to be massively fearful of, but measles is super, super, super contagious. And if you don't have a vaccine, then you will get it. Basically, everybody does, and you can have side effects. Some people do die, and the big issue with it is pneumonia and secondary infection. So yes, some kids will get really sick. So it's not that you shouldn't get vaccines or vaccines can't be helpful or that they don't help us with the complications, but I think it needs to be put into an appropriate context of what we're actually doing, which is really, in general, preventing secondary infection, preventing it from spreading around, and preventing a few deaths, which obviously we want to prevent every death that we can, but you have to put that in the context of what are the risks from the vaccine, and those are the kind of nuanced discussions that we do need to have moving forward. But a lot of these vaccines did decrease the amount of the disease. So like you said with chickenpox, I think that's a perfect example, because sometimes people say, oh, vaccines didn't do anything. Well, that's not true either, right? Like we all had chickenpox when we were little, and that was not that long ago. Even maybe 20 years ago, there was tons of chickenpox, and then the vaccine came out, and now you don't really see it in kids anymore. So that's what a lot of the vaccines actually have done, is really decrease the spread of these diseases, so that's not really around, and so you don't get it. But does it kill a lot of kids? No, they don't. I mean, does chickenpox kill a lot of people? No, it doesn't. It never did. But you still can get pretty sick when millions of people get it. A few kids get really sick. So that's the trade-off there. And I think that's where you need to start. And that's why I think it's important to have that background and that history, and that's where when I wrote the book I tried to do, because it's incorrect to say vaccines don't have any good. They certainly do, and there certainly are benefits, and we need to understand what those are, so that way we can put that in the context of, okay, but what are the risks from the vaccine, so we can weigh whether that makes sense for you to get it or not, because just because you have a vaccine doesn't mean we should do it. We have a smallpox vaccine. We haven't had smallpox in many, many years, like decades, but we could just give everyone a smallpox vaccine just because, right? And so that's where modern discussions, let's say around polio, right? We haven't had polio in America in a very long time, but we still give kids at 2 months old polio vaccines, and they still get multiple of them in the first few months. And I think it's not an unreasonable question to say, hey, do we have to give all kids at 2 months old a polio vaccine? Like, obviously, we don't want polio to come back. And if it did, that might change things. But could we move polio back to later on? Maybe that's something we don't have to give four anymore of. Maybe we can just do one. Maybe we could do it 1 or 10. I don't know. Like, these are questions we should be asking, but we shouldn't just be doing things just because. We should have discussions around the nuance and back to like these original questions, like what are they talking about at HHS and the vaccine panels, like how or if we should make any changes, which has not been discussed for decades.
Yeah, that's so important. And a lot of people are wondering how vaccines work. Is it just some sort of like magic potion that's in the in the vial? And vaccines, I always think about like a hormetic stressor, kind of like, for example, exercise or something like that. It's basically putting that viral component into, or whatever the antigen, the pathogen is, into your system in a weakened state so that your immune system can then basically create a response. Kind of like exercise. Exercise is a stressor on our body. Where it's beneficial is when we get the nutrients, the rest we need, and the appropriate dose of exercise so we can then adapt and recover and our body becomes more resilient. That's kind of the idea of vaccines as well. The issue is we know in exercise that the dose needs to be personalized, right? Depending on your initial conditioning, right? Like, for example, a 70-year-old woman, my mom, wouldn't do the same workout that I could do as a very fit, 43-year-old man. Okay. If I gave her my workout, she would overtrain and be sore for a week, right? And probably just lay in her bed. She would have massive inflammation in her system. In the vaccine schedule, it's one size fits all. So no matter what the child comes in with, no matter what their kind of baseline immune fitness is, they're getting the same dosages, the same recommendations. And that's not how hormetic stress works. So for some people, they're going to get benefit. Other people, they're going to have massive, some sort of a negative response because they're overwhelming their system.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I guess even before we go on from here, I think it's important to say, like, for me, I'm not against vaccines. We get vaccines in my office. I personally believe in personal choice. Like, I think that people should be able to choose whether they want to do something. My job, I think, is to give informed consent, is to explain things, is talk about what we do and we don't know, and let parents make decisions that are best for them. We have people that do the regular schedule. Some people do a slow schedule. Some people don't do it. And I think that's the way that we should be doing things. Again, I'm not against vaccines. I just don't think they should be forced on people, and I think we should be able to have discussions like these and talk about it and just like you said, yeah, it needs to be more personalized. I think ultimately a generalized schedule is good for a generalized recommendation, but at the individual level, each person is different. And as soon as you start to force things on people, especially kids that are more sensitive or have certain genetic conditions or whatever it may be, then we start running into issues. And I think we've crossed that line now, where especially in states where there's a much stronger vaccine requirements, that pushes people. It's really tough to individualize anything. And when it comes to vaccines, we weren't even able to have the conversation around issues and problems with vaccines. And if you can't have those discussions around problems, you can't make them better. And I think that's a huge issue that we have right now, in that there isn't a push to make vaccines better or safer. And there's not even acknowledgement that they could cause problems. And the standard kind of discussion is like, oh, it's 1 in a million kids has a severe reaction. I don't think that's true. I think it's more than that. I'm positive it's more than that, and that's just of what we know, and we really just don't have a good understanding of long-term risks and whether asthma and allergies and all these other things are really related to vaccines, because we don't really study them long-term. And I think that's really important to do, because ultimately we are injecting our kids with more and more vaccines, and these are meant to stimulate your immune system, right? That's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to create a positive response, a memory, but for some kids, I'm sure it can cause a negative issue, and we can't talk about that, and we can't study that, and we can't look into that, because instead of not doing that, we should be saying, who are the kids that have a reaction and why, and figuring that out so we can minimize that. Like, maybe we could do some genetic testing and figure out which genetics have a problem with certain vaccines, and those are the kids that don't get it or get different ones. Maybe there's some ingredient in there that increases your risk for asthma. Like, wouldn't we want to know that? If you were like, hey, the hepatitis B vaccine this ingredient increases your risk of asthma by 10 times. Like, why wouldn't we want to know that? You would say, okay, well, why? Which ingredient? Let's change it. Maybe there's a different ingredient we can put in there. Maybe we don't do it at that time. But you can't even have that discussion, or at least we couldn't. And in the backdrop of the stuff we talked about first, which is this chronic disease epidemic, it is not unreasonable to say to ask the question whether vaccines are contributing to that chronic disease epidemic. It's certainly not the only thing. It's definitely not the only thing that causes autism or the only thing that causes allergies. I mean, of course not. There are kids that have never been vaccinated that have these things. But when you have something that's affecting so many kids' immune systems, you have to say, well, can a vaccine affect some kids sometimes in certain settings? That's its actual job. So what if it does it in a different way, or an incorrect way, or affects you in a negative way because of your genetics or your susceptibility, especially in the setting of kids that are so bombarded with chemicals? It might be the thing that pushes kids over the edge sometimes, and we need to figure out if that's happening and why, so we can minimize that. And I think that's an important question, and that's what Secretary Kennedy is asking, and a lot of people are asking, and we shouldn't run away from that question. It doesn't mean you shouldn't vaccinate. It just means we should be able to make these vaccines safer over the next decade, and we're not going to do that if we don't ask the questions. Especially, and I don't know if you want to get into this, but especially in the setting of the fact that vaccine manufacturers don't have liability,
Yeah.
there's really no push to make them better.
Yeah, it's so important. So the vaccine manufacturers can't get sued if their product is not good, right? If it's full of toxins, if it's contaminated, things like that, they can't get sued, and that is a big issue. So there's no incentive there for those companies to make the best possible vaccines, and that's what we should be doing. Like, that's typically what the market forces put on businesses, is to constantly improve in order to survive, in order to thrive. You have to constantly improve your product. But when you don't have that legal liability, there's no incentive, like you were talking about there. And you mentioned hepatitis B. That's certainly come under more scrutiny, and for good reason, lately. And so let's talk about the hepatitis B vaccine.
Yeah, I would say of all the vaccines that are given for the childhood schedule, that one seems to be the most controversial at the moment. And I mean, maybe not controversial is the right word, but certainly the one that most people are choosing not to do on the regular schedule, because it's offered as a newborn first day of life, basically, right when you're born. Here's your hepatitis B vaccine. You're given it in the hospital, and a lot of parents are starting to really push back and question on that. So originally, when the hepatitis B vaccine came out, in the late 80s, early 90s, it was for high risk populations, right? So generally, you get hepatitis B through blood or sexual contact. So high risk individuals, so healthcare workers or prostitutes, things like that, were the main people that got it. But there still were lots of cases of hepatitis B, because you still can get it through blood. Someone could bleed on you. You could touch it. It could get off of surfaces. It's not very commonly obtained that way, but it's still possible. And given that there were still so many cases of it, and certainly a lot of cases worldwide, it was recommended that it was to be given to newborn babies to protect babies from obtaining it. The main way that babies get it would be from mom. So if mom has hepatitis B through birth, then there's a good chance the baby will get it if mom has it and they're not protected. So that is a real and good reason to consider getting hepatitis B if you have hepatitis B, right? But the thing is that now we test everybody. So now we know if mom has hepatitis B, and so that really does change the risk profile for a newborn baby, because you know if mom has it. Now, yes, there's a chance the test could be wrong. Yes, there's a chance that you never got tested. Yes, there's a chance that you got hepatitis B after you were tested. I mean, all those are super small risk, but it's there. So I think those are things that need to be explained to a parent, in terms of if they want to get the hepatitis B vaccine. But if you are negative and your partner is negative and you're not going anywhere for the first couple weeks anyways, the risk of your baby getting hepatitis B is basically zero. It's not zero. Could somebody come in your house and bleed on your baby and give them hepatitis B that doesn't know they have hepatitis B? Yeah, sure, that's there. That's a real risk. What? It's 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million? I don't know. So I think that's something that needs to be explained to parents, because it's possible. But other than that, if you don't have hepatitis B, your baby's not getting it. So it's an extremely reasonable question to say, should we be recommending this to everybody? Or should we be explaining their risk and letting people choose whether they want to do it now or whether they want to do it later in life? Because everything has risk. And of course, the hepatitis B vaccine has risk too. And I think it's a reasonable question to say, how does giving a vaccine to a 1-day-old baby affect their immune system long term? I think that's an important question. And even just from the short term, does a vaccine give you fever sometimes? Yes, it does, right? That's well known. And in hepatitis B, it's about 1 to 5% of babies get a fever. And what happens to a newborn who gets a fever, right? You go to the hospital, you get a full workup, you get a lumbar puncture. So you're also exposing all those babies who get a fever from the hepatitis B vaccine to a full workup, a hospitalization, a lumbar puncture, all these things for a disease they were never going to get in the first place. So you have to weigh it, and that's why it's nuanced. You have to weigh what is the benefit of preventing hepatitis B and how many babies are we preventing, and do I want that benefit versus what are the risks, and which one do I think is more important for me? And those are not questions you've ever been able to ask before. It's just, well, just go do it because we don't want anybody to have hepatitis B. And I don't want anyone to have hepatitis B. I don't want any babies to get hepatitis B. I don't want any chronic hepatitis B and cancer. Like, of course not. But I also don't want to vaccinate millions of kids and create thousands of problems versus protecting one kid. Like you have to weigh those two things on balance. That's what public health is. And I think that's what's been tasked of the ACIP and of the new discussions. And I don't think that's unreasonable. And I don't know what ultimately they're going to decide, but I don't think it's unreasonable to say, look, the risk is really, really small of hepatitis B. Maybe we move that back and just recommend it, but don't require it and have it as a shared decision making. And kids can get it later. Like that's not anti-science or anti-anything. It's weighing risks versus benefits and deciding, well, maybe the risk is just too high to give a newborn this vaccine when they don't really have a big risk. And let me explain to mom the risk. And maybe some people are going to say, no, I don't want any risk of hepatitis B. They'll take the vaccine. That's fine. And if you do have hepatitis B, you really should definitely get protection, right? You what you're getting hepatitis B. But for the average parent, maybe they don't have to do it on day one. They could do it later. I don't think that's unreasonable.
Yeah, for sure. We got to have more nuanced discussion with it. Now, let's pivot to vaccine studies, how the vaccines are studied, because I know for years I thought vaccines are probably just like every other drug. When they do studies, they use a placebo or an inert, some sort of inert. Like, for example, if you're going to study Tylenol, you study it against a sugar pill, right? The sugar pill basically has no active constituents in it that are going to promote a response, and that would be kind of a good placebo, right? With vaccines, they're not doing that, are they?
So they're not, and that's what's interesting, right? Because again, I always thought that they were. Right? I mean, I think most people do because you're told, the vaccines are the most studied thing ever. We have so many studies. They couldn't ever possibly put these on market without doing it. Oh, they have tons of placebo studies. What are you talking about, right? Like that's kind of the mainstream discussion, and that's what you're told. And so, like, why would you go look it up yourself? You obviously believe that that's probably true. And when you go look at the actual research of the vaccines on the regular childhood schedule, it is quite shocking when you go back in history to see what was actually done and what these were approved based upon. And like you said, so a placebo by definition is something that's inert, right? That's what it's supposed to be. So inert meaning like saltwater saline, not having really any effect on the body. Now, when it comes to most of the vaccines, basically all of them on the childhood schedule, they're all studied. Of course they are. They had studies before they hit the market, but they use a little trick, which is the placebo isn't actually an inert substance. In general, it's some other vaccine or the actual vaccine without the antigen in it. And so it's an active placebo. So they could say, yes, we did placebo testing, but they actually didn't study it against an inert substance. And why that's so important is then you only get relative safety versus absolute safety. And what I mean by that is if you're studying vaccine A versus vaccine B, and in both groups you get 10 seizures, then at the end of the study you can conclude, well, both groups had 10 seizures, so 10 seizures is normal, and therefore it's safe because there's no increased risk, which is very different than, let's say, doing a study for vaccine A versus vaccine B versus an inert placebo, where let's say you had 10 seizures, and 1 seizure. You can see how that's very different. And so it doesn't mean that just because you don't have a placebo, something is unsafe, but you just don't have the best kind of information on safety to actually know what the true risk is. And again, that all goes back to if you go way, way back in history to the original, like whooping coughs and those kind of things, they never studied them in that way because they didn't do research like that. Back in the 30s and 40s, a lot of times they just were like, well, we have this new product, let's just see if it works. And so, you vaccinate one person and then you vaccinate their brother, and then you see if it works better. Like that's how they did the original studies. So they didn't do a lot of safety testing, even in terms of the way that we would think about it now. And then more recently, like they're doing it that way because, again, they don't have liability, so they have no reason to try to find problems. The best way they can rig the deck in their studies is to have something that's have equal risk, and therefore it's less likely they're going to find a problem because you're comparing it against another vaccine. And so that's really, really important because, for example, whooping cough, right? If you're studying the old DTP, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccine against the new one. So the original was the whole cell vaccine. We now have the acellular pertussis. That's what we do now. But the new one was studied against the old one, the DTP. And the old one was taken off the market for concerns around safety and neurologic concerns. So the question is then, well, is the one we have on the market now safe? Or is it safe compared to the old one, which was taken off the market? And that's, again, it's a reasonable question. I mean, it was found to be safer, so that's good. That's why they switched it. But again, if you're not studying it against a saline placebo, then maybe both are unsafe. And that's not to say we don't want to protect against whooping cough. But if you study it the most appropriate way, you might say, well, we have all these issues. That's not a good enough vaccine. Let's make a better one, right? And that's not what we're getting these days. We're just getting, well, here's one that works well enough. Good luck to you. And we're never going to study it again. And you think that a company is going to do a study now of like, hey, let's spend billions of dollars, let's look and see if we can find a problem with our vaccine so we can pull it off the market. Like, they're never going to do that. So we don't have anybody pushing back on safety or trying to make them safer, and that's a big problem in the vaccine world.
Yeah, that is a big issue. And then when you look at the ingredients and during your medical training, were you ever taught about the ingredients and how to make the vaccine? Probably not, right? You were just
not really. I mean, did we have handouts that probably had all the lists of ingredients in there? Yeah, I'm sure like it was there somewhere. If I'm remembering back, like we got some handouts of the vaccine and the ingredient, but like you weren't talking about it, we weren't discussing it. I mean, any vaccine has a long list of ingredients, so you're gonna look and be like, oh, polysorbate 80, like whatever. We're not talking about the ingredients. It's just you can look at the ingredient label if you want to, but you don't really know any of those things do. And for the most part, we weren't. So no. I mean, the answer is really no. You're not talking about ingredients. You're not learning about ingredients. And even if you were, like, what would that look like? We're not chemists or scientists. So you could be like, well, these ingredients are in there, but is that good or bad? What does that mean? I don't know. I don't think we're even taught that. I think what would be great is if we were taught to question, right? Like what and I made the joke in the book, like we're not taught why not to trust pharma 101, right? But that is what doctors need to be taught. Like, what is pharma doing? How are they marketing to you? What are their tricks and tools? How have they been doing these things for years? And why you shouldn't necessarily believe what you're told, or what has been, just because it's been done for 10 or 20 years doesn't mean it's based on all the best definitive evidence or safety or whatever that may be. Like hepatitis B, it's the safety trials that are on the package inserts were 5 days, 4 or 5 days. It's like, we're giving a thing to a newborn that was licensed based on a safety trial that's 5 days, and you're like, that can't possibly be true. And Aaron Siri, the lawyer who's done a lot of these cases, was like, that can't possibly be true. And he Freedom of Information Act the government to find other, what other trials there were, and they didn't have anything else. So unless there's some secret stuff, it's like you assume that something you're giving to a newborn baby on day one has very robust, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of kids, studied for years, and you're talking about research that's in the package label, 150 kids, 5 days. That's not good enough, right? That's not me saying I don't want a hepatitis B vaccine. That's saying we cannot allow that. If we're ever going, we shouldn't allow that right now. We should redo the testing to make sure that it's safe, and we should, for anything in the future, require better than that. And that, again, it's not anti-science. Like, if you're going to vaccinate my newborn baby, I expect you to have studied millions of kids or hundreds of thousands of kids and studied them for a long time to make sure that it is safe before you do it, especially for something like hepatitis B, which you're probably not going to get anyways. There's got to be a very high bar to give every kid that thing. And questioning that bar when you're talking about research on 150 kids for 5 days is not good enough. And it's also not good enough to say, well, we've been doing it for 20 years and it's fine, right? Well, we don't know that, because you don't know if it causes cancer 10 years after you get it. We don't actually know. Not saying it does, but if you're giving a newborn baby something, you better be damn sure that it's safe, and you better be okay studying it 1,000 times. And that's not what's happening.
Yeah, and what you're saying here would have been deemed anti-science years ago, and still in some circles it is, but it's really pro-science. It's really saying we need more science, and we need to figure out we need to figure out really what the science is going to say as we do more, because science is constantly we're learning through science, and we don't want to just stop learning. And that's kind of what and this is where the trust in the medical institution has gone down, is kind of these blanket statements like the science is settled, the science is done. But that's an anti-science statement. That's more of a faith-based statement, rather than a science-based statement. So you're coming, from my perspective, obviously you're a lot more scientific in the way that you're nuancing this, right? This conversation than most people in the medical institution, who will just say, "Don't worry about it. The science is done."
Right, and I think that's the key, is you have to have some humility. Like when you go look at the research and you're like, well, this is what it's based upon, you have to step back and say, well, why am I doing this? Am I doing this to vaccinate more kids, or am I doing it to have healthier kids? Right? And those two things are not the same sentence. They might be. I mean, more vaccines might be better, but it also might not be better. And the only way to answer that question is to actually study it. And I don't feel that we are at a place where we can confidently say giving a newborn baby a vaccine is better for them long term, or giving 50 vaccines to a baby is great, or, well, 50 is good, so let's do 100. Like, at what point does it become too many? Maybe we're already there, maybe not. But you can't just go on blind faith that these things are so good, especially when you're looking at our general health declining for the first time. Then you have to go back and say, well, look, we do live longer than 100 years ago, so not everything we're doing in modern day is bad, right? Like, we're not dying at 40 anymore, but we're also going back in our lifespan. So maybe some of the things we've been doing in the last 20 years are not so great, and maybe vaccines are a part of that. Maybe it's not. Maybe we're doing too many. Maybe we're not prioritizing them correctly. Maybe the schedule is not the best one. Like, it's not like we have the only schedule in the whole world. There are different ways that people do it. Not everybody gives a Hep B on day one. So asking these questions is not anti-science. It's literally science. It's literally saying, look, I'm okay with 100 vaccines or 0 vaccines, depending on which one creates the healthiest kids, and whichever one's best for your kid. And we shouldn't just assume that it's the best when we have this chronic disease epidemic. We should think about these things and say, well, what are some of the biggest potential risk factors that could be driving these conditions, and let's look at that. That's it. That's all I'm saying. And it may turn out that vaccines do nothing, and nothing bad, and that's great. That's fine. That's going to give people confidence to do more of them. But it also may turn out that giving a newborn a vaccine on day one is not the best for your long-term health. And we should know that, because then, maybe it's not to say you don't do hepatitis B vaccine. Maybe you do it at 2 months old. Maybe you do it at 10 years old. I don't know what the answer is. That's what the research is for. But do you want to give a kid something to create a problem? Like, obviously you don't. That's not what I'm doing here, right? I'm not trying to give a kid a vaccine because I want to create asthma. I want to give it to them to protect them from the thing. So we have to balance the benefits versus the risks. And going on blind faith and religion actually is pushing people away from doing vaccines.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And when I look at the ingredients, I get a lot of concerns. When I look at your typical ingredients that are in a vaccine, you've got things like aluminum, for example, which is a common adjuvant. An adjuvant is something that's actually supposed to aggravate the immune system, right? To get the appropriate immune response. It aggravates. You have things like formaldehyde, which is just part of the processing. Some vaccines still have thimerosal, mercury, like the flu vaccine, for example. And then you've got all these different stabilizers like polyethylene glycol, polysorbate 80. These are things that I would never want to ingest. Like any one of those, if you said, hey, there's aluminum in your bread here, right? Or there's aluminum on this steak, I would say, I'm going to throw the steak out, right? I'm not going to ingest it. I'm not going to ingest polysorbate 80, right? Polyethylene glycol, which is antifreeze. Like, I'm not going to ingest that with, if you told any parent, like, hey, this is this chemical right here is on your food, they would throw it out. And yet, we're injecting that into our bloodstream and told that it's safe, right? And so I think this is a big concern as well.
Yeah, I mean, so the ingredients are a huge concern in general, right? I think that's where one of the big concerns that parents have, especially aluminum, probably the biggest concern that parents have today. The flip side of that, the modern medicine kind of take on it is, well, it's a really small amount. You get these things in your food, and you get these things in the environment, and they're there. So this is just a fraction amount, and it's not a big deal. and so don't worry about it. That's kind of the mainstream opinion on it, and some of that's true. I mean, yeah, we get a lot of these things in our daily life. I mean, there is aluminum out there, and you do ingest it in some other things, but I don't think you're trying to get extra of it, right? I mean, it's just there, and a small amount of it is good. But I still think that just way oversimplifies it to me. It doesn't sit well, that explanation, just personally, because I don't think ingesting it's the same thing as injecting, and I don't know why that's thought to be the same thing. It's like, okay, yes, your body has evolved to ingest some of these things, and even still, we're having a lot of problems. So maybe we're just ingesting too much, but that's not the same thing as bypassing your regular immune system and the natural barriers and injecting it into you, and then doing that in combination with a whole bunch of other chemicals and how your body handles that. That's not the same thing. So even a small amount could be a problem for some people in that form. And yeah, even for some people, they walk by a peanut and they smell it, and that's enough to cause anaphylaxis. So why, even if it's a small amount of aluminum or whatever other ingredient that's injected, couldn't that create some sort of massive response in your body for a percentage of people? I don't see why that's not possible. I would think that's actually likely. And if we ignore that biological plausibility, we don't figure out who and why is most susceptible and why this is happening, and we just kind of write it off. So I think that's just a bad argument. And I think that, yes, we do get more of these oftentimes, so it's not that necessarily getting one vaccine is so horrible for everybody, but I do think for some people, you could be allergic to an ingredient, you could have a bad reaction to an ingredient, you could be injecting aluminum in a way that causes a problem for you, and I don't think we should brush that off as crazy.
Especially the cumulative load with all of the vaccines, all containing that aluminum, the overall load starts really going up.
Right, and that's that's a really good point, and another big thing is this cumulative effect, which we never discuss, and that's I mean, I talk a whole chapter in my book on that, because I think that's one of the huge questions that's not thought about at all is, okay, well, maybe it's true most people could take aluminum from one vaccine, but then you start getting more and more vaccines, and now we're doing vaccines at 2 months and 4 months and 6 months, and multiple of them have aluminum in it, and again, they would say, well, it's still so much less than what you ingest. And again, that's true. But some people don't have kidneys that work so well, or they have genetic conditions that just don't detoxify as well. So maybe for those kids, that load is too much, or maybe we're getting to too high a load. I don't know. I mean, again, these are the questions that we should be able to ask and discuss so that we can focus on that, because maybe a little bit is okay, but just like everything else, you can have a little bit of lead and it's probably not going to kill you, right? But if you have more and more, it will kill you. So it's okay to ask the question, like, well, now that we're doing more vaccines, is that a problem? Just like we did with mercury and thimerosal, they never thought about the fact that there was all this mercury in vaccines. It's so crazy. It's like you go back and you're like, no one thought about safety, but just in the late 1990s, early 2000s, someone was like, hey, wait a minute, there's more mercury in vaccines than we allow in food. Yeah, it's a different form, so we don't really know how that works for safety in your body, but is that okay? Like, we just told people not to have mercury in fish and not to have it in pregnancy, and yet there's more that we're injecting into kids in vaccines. Is that safe? I don't know. Like that's how the safety testing was done back then. So, it does call into question of safety on everything else, where you're like, well, what if they're not thinking about mercury? Then what else are they not thinking about in terms of safety? And so, yeah, it was pulled. And again, back to what they've done, like Kennedy pulled it out of all vaccines, so it's not going to be any more vaccines in America, which is good, because we have flu vaccines that don't have it in there anyways. But yeah, like these are things we should be thinking about, and we should be talking about, and we should be able to ask questions, and ultimately it may turn out that it doesn't cause a problem, but it shouldn't be woo-woo to say, like, is it okay to inject mercury? Is it okay to inject aluminum? Can we keep studying this? Like we need to keep studying it, and the more that we do, either the more we're going to find that it's a problem and we're going to change it, or we're going to find that it's not a problem through better and better research, and people will be more confident to do it. And that either way, those are good.
Yeah, both are good, because I really think they can make vaccines much better. I think they can make them significantly better if there was the incentive to do it. And I'm called an anti-vaxxer, and I didn't vaccinate my kids. I never told any of my patients. I always caution them about vaccines. And so I'm labeled as an anti-vaxxer. You probably are as well, just for questioning it.
Sure.
However, the reason why I don't vaccinate my kids is 3 reasons. Number one, the vaccine schedule is not personalized, right? It's not personalized for each individual. I'm highly concerned about the ingredients that are in there. and lack of safety studies, right? Those three things are really the big reason. And I also feel like for my kids and in our situation, you know, I know a lot about health. I feel like my kids, they don't need the vaccines, right? They're not at risk for these kind of infections. Now, somebody maybe in a very poor, unsanitized area, going to be at higher risk for some of these issues, and then you know that conversation needs to come about as far as the benefits of those vaccines. But that was for me. I realized, you know what, we're not. My wife and I both agreed we're not going to vaccinate our kids because we don't have great vaccines out there, in my opinion, and I believe that they're going to cause more risks than benefits for my children. And that's what I personally believe for most kids in the United States are actually going to cause more risks than benefits. I know you're kind of a neutral position there, but I'm not anti-vaccine from the perspective that I'm against the entire industry and the technology. I think that vaccines could be better. I mean, there's supplements that I recommend that part of the way that those supplements work is by having a hormetic stress response on the body. Like that's why some of these supplements, like for example, turmeric, that's why it works to help reduce inflammation in the body. And the right dose can be really effective for somebody. And so I think if done properly, if the vaccine manufacturers and the scientists really got together and they had all these nuances, all the questions that you're asking, I think that they could actually make really, really good vaccines in the future that, you know, even somebody like myself would have to consider, would actually give more consideration to.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and again, goes back to kind of what we were talking about with the liability rules is in America, especially, or Western world, like with capitalism, the big incentive is getting sued, right? I mean, that's the
Yeah.
big incentive to make your product better and safer. And for most medications, they study them for half a decade to a decade before they put on the market because they're very worried that if there's these problems that pop up, then they're going to get sued and it's not going to end up being worth it for them. Whereas the vaccines is opposite. They have no reason to study it for safety. The only thing they want to do is get it on the market because once it's on the market, then you get pushed to get it from outside. You don't have to market it because the government does that for you, and you can't be sued. And so once it hits the market, there's no reason for them to make it better because they can't get sued. So ultimately, and I don't know if suing is the right answer or not. I mean, maybe we got to change those rules to some degree, but that's obviously, again, complicated. But we have to have some way to make them better. Like a lot of these vaccines haven't really been changed in the last 20, 30 years for some of them. And that's crazy. Like that's insane. We're giving this to all kids. Like there's no reason we can't make them better and we shouldn't make them better. And hopefully over time there'll be new technologies. Maybe you could, have it sprayed in your nose. Like some of the vaccines, like the flu shot, you can spray it in your nose. Rotavirus, you could drink it. Like maybe there are versions of some of these vaccines where we could take it orally. That will make it safer. Maybe it could be like rubbed on your skin, just to give you a little bit of a reaction, but not a big one. I don't know what the answer is, but I don't think that we have the very best vaccines we're ever going to have. Like for example, the DTaP vaccine with all the issues that we have for whooping cough, you had to take it 5 times in the first 2 years for it to even kind of work. And then it goes, like, you can't tell me that's the best version of a whooping cough vaccine we're ever going to have. You need to take it 5 times for it to work, and then every 10 years, and then even still people get whooping cough outbreaks all the time. Like that's not the best technology. There has to be better versions that we can do. So I just think that we're stagnant because of where we are and because of this pharma push that they have all this money and they know that they want to keep the status quo, because as long as they can keep the status quo, they have multi-billion, trillion-dollar industry with no pushback. And that is not the best thing for our kid. The best thing for our kids is continual discussion and continual updating. So that way in 10 years we have better vaccines and more vaccines available, and maybe a more personalized approach to what makes sense for each specific area or each specific kid, or maybe we prioritize the top 2 or 3 that they need instead of giving them 10 or 20. And I don't know, maybe it's just one that has a bunch of antigens in it that you drink and that has very minimal side effects and you get protection from 50 diseases from one little drink. I don't know, like all these things are potentially possible, and I don't think anybody is against the concept of vaccination. Like if you were to give your kid a pill, one pill, and you were like, all right, you can take this magic pill and it's never going to cause any side effects and they're never going to get sick in their life, I think most people would be open to that, but that's not life, right? The question is, okay, but at what cost? What does it do to me? What's the negative? And that is the thing that you're not allowed to talk about. And ultimately, the more safe we can make these things, the more people are going to want to do it. But Alternatively, we're just going to be forced to do things we don't want to do. And that's the direction that things were moving. And that's what happened during COVID. And that was the ultimate conclusion of where things were going. And thankfully, there's been some pushback on that, strong pushback. And I hope that we'll never see that again. And freedom of choice and freedom of to do the science and ask the questions, and ultimately not censorship, but conversation is the best way to move forward. And that's why I wrote the book, right? I did not write the book to get people to vaccinate or not vaccinate. It's really to have discussions like this, which we were never able to do and need to be able to happen, because you have to be able to have a nuanced, honest, kind conversation that doesn't, devolve into people yelling at each other when it comes to vaccines. It's a product. It's not a religion. It's just a medical product, and we want it to be the best it can be. And if you can't talk like this, then our kids are the ones that lose out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm so thankful that you put out this book and just for your voice online and the message that you're getting out. Guys, check out Dr. Joel Warsh's book. It's Between a Shot and a Hard Place, Tackling Vaccine Questions with Balanced Data and Clarity. You can get it at theshotbook.com or on Amazon or wherever books are sold. Definitely check that out in great detail. And Dr. Joel, I really appreciate everything that you're doing out there and spreading the message to make America healthy again. Where can people find out more information about you? I know you got a clinic in Los Angeles. And any last words of inspiration here for our audience?
Yeah, I mean, thank you again for having this conversation. And not everybody is willing to do it. More people are, but not everybody. So I always thank everyone for having a vaccine conversation, because it's a crazy topic. Shouldn't be, but it is. And then for the parents, I think it's not woo woo to ask questions. You shouldn't feel that way. A lot of people have questions. I mean, that's the reality of the world right now, and so you need to ask questions. That's what's going to make the change. Push your doctor, ask the questions, do the research, learn about it. I think that's where we need to be, and it's okay to ask questions. It doesn't make you woo woo or anything like that. So yeah, I'm Dr. Joel Gator. You can find me Instagram, X, the book Between a Shot and a Hard Place. It's on Amazon or at theshotbook.com.
Awesome. Thanks again, Dr. Joel.
Thank you.